Not gonna be-
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're with Ettie Zilber, who's discussing her amazing Holocaust story of her parents. And she's written a fabulous memoir called The Holocaust Memoir of Love, Resilience, Mama's Survival from Lithuania to America. So welcome, Ettie, back. And we are talking about displacement camp and when your parents would tell you about their Holocaust situation. And why don't you just recap a little bit about that picture that you shared and show it again, and then we will talk a little bit about it. Maybe you can point out some other people who are in the photo that, and go ahead.
Well, as I was saying, we are so fortunate because in our family, we have a lot of photos from before the war. And there are a lot of reasons why we have them. But most survivors have absolutely not one photo of a loved one, which is a tragedy that I can't imagine. So Jeffrey asked me, when did I learn about the Holocaust from my parents? And I said, okay, well, first of all, I was born in a DP camp, and I always knew that I was born over there because I came over here.
And we didn't say which DP camp were you born in?
Landsberg am Lech is just outside of Munich, about 100 kilometers west of Munich and southern Germany, and beautiful town. And that's where one of the many DP camps were dotted all around southern Germany, Austria.
So how many individuals were there, and mostly survivors, obviously?
Oh, all survivors. And Landsberg was one of the largest DP camps, and also one of the first to be populated only by Jews, because originally the DP camps were just, everybody was stuck together with their national group. So the same Polish Jew could be sitting next door to a non-Jewish Pole who might not have behaved so well during the war in Poland. So this one was all Jews, and a huge number of the Lithuanian survivors were there as well, but there were survivors from many other countries. And so, as I was saying, I was born there, like millions of other babies. It was the biggest baby boom in history. And on the wall of our home, we're always hanging the family photos. And this is my mother. I got to go reverse. This is my mother, my grandfather, Jakob Santotsky, my mother Zlata, my grandmother Etta, for whom I'm named, and the baby was Genya. This is her third sister, Nahama. Nahama survived. And this is Ida. Ida was killed, as I was telling you, in those hideouts in the Malinas. She was burned to death in a Malina.
And what about the youngest one?
The youngest one and my grandmother were murdered in Auschwitz, and my grandfather died in the labor camp of Dachau called Kaufering.
Do you know when they were transported to Auschwitz?
Oh yeah, it was right after they got to Stutthof. They made a selection, and anybody who was not fit for work was sent to Auschwitz, of course.
And what year, what month and year? What month and year, so we can, our listeners.
July 44.
So my mother was deported from Košice in Czechoslovakia in May of 44 with her family, her three older sisters. Well, her baby sister Magda, which was 8, and her 2 older sisters. Mom was 15, then Handy was 18, and Edith was 21, and her mother and father. So yeah, so it's kind of it's a small world how all this puzzle pieces meet, and the threads of our second generation all kind of touch each other. And I'm always wondering when I will, in whatever picture I look at, whoever I meet, I'm always wondering if they knew my mom.
Well, yeah, that definitely comes up quite often. Other photos that we had showed other members of the family. And so the conversation was immediately, well, where are my grandparents? Well, they were killed. Why were they killed? Well, et cetera, et cetera. So we
So
knew,
you knew this as a grade
I
school,
know
as,
this as mother's milk.
yeah.
And
And what about your father's side?
now
How,
my father's side of the family, here they are. My father's side of the family, this is my dad, my grandfather Feivel, my grandmother Chaicha, and the little sister Rivka, who's still alive today.
oh, beautiful. And
Yeah,
and what happened to those? Were they did not survive?
no, this is a miracle story. I don't think there are very many stories like this one, that a nuclear family survived intact, not from hiding, but going through ghetto, transport, concentration camp, death march, and well, my dad escaped at one point, and they survived intact, not
Tell me,
together,
tell me
but
how old was the baby?
well, during the war, she was 12, 13, 14.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did she survive the selection process? Because Magda was, when they arrived, she was pointed by Mengele to go to the left, and her mother wouldn't let go of her hand, and they both perished on day one. So how, is there some sense of a story you have about a child survivor? That's quite amazing.
Yes, in the ghetto, they had what they called the Kinderaktie, the children's action, where they came in and they took away 1,500 children. They managed to hide the kids during that aktia. So the kids survived the aktia. And actually, she was probably 11 during the aktia, but she was found, but she told the Ukrainian that she was 12, and the aktia was for children below 12. So she lied her way out of that one, and she was a big girl. So in Stutthof, she was able to do the physical labor, and so she was working, as was my other aunt, who also, they were good friends, and so they survived together with my grandmother. And
And who liberated the Russians liberated Stutt?
they were not liberated in Stutthof. They were liberated on a death march in a village in a town in Poland.
Oh,
My
wow.
mother was also liberated from a death march.
By whom?
All the Soviets. The only
Mhm.
one, my grandfather, he was down in southern Germany. He was liberated by the Americans. And
Now,
my
do you have a
father,
story? Do you have a story about liberation that your parents told you?
oh, the stories, the stories. Yeah, I got a lot of stories about liberation. My mother, with a few hundred other women, were in a barn. Most of them were dying of typhus. And, every day they would pull out the dead bodies. And anyway, one morning, one woman went out to relieve herself, and there were no Nazi guards anymore. And so they realized they were, liberated. It was the end of the war. And then within an hour or two, the Soviets marched in and they took over the camp. And to their credit, they set up a clinic, a hospital. They started taking care of the sick, and they were all very, very sick. And and so that was the story. Same thing with my grandmother and my two aunts.
Was there any Jewish Soviets that
Yes,
liberated?
yes.
And do you
Jewish
have any
Soviets liberated? No, a liberator.
right?
Yeah, yeah. There was one guy who, my mother was together with a few other girls. This is a typical story in concentration camps. Women used to hook up together with other women, and they saved each other.
Yeah,
They were called Lagerschwesters, camp sisters.
right.
And so they took care of each other, and this is how they helped each other survive. It was an unusual thing, and all of them did survive, which is amazing. But they tell the story of one Jewish Soviet soldier who came over to them and said, "Put a sign on the door that says you have typhus because the men are looking for women." And he basically came into their room with his gun and he sat there and stood guard over them so that the soldiers wouldn't come in and touch them. So that's one of my mother's stories.
That's amazing story.
Yeah,
So, so
yeah.
that, so let's keep going. When did you, how long did you spend time in the DP camp, and when did you come to, how did you get to the United States? Were you sponsored? Was your somehow, what's the story behind you? That wasn't easy to come to the United States. You needed to get a visa, and how did that all work out?
Well, as it turns out, I have been able to acquire my entire family file from HIAS.
Wow.
And so I have the entire history of what transpired during the years after the war, from the time they registered themselves, because everybody had to register, and to the time that they eventually got the visa.
So can I stop you there for a second? Our audience would just love to hear just a couple tips on how you figured out how to get that file.
Simple. I wrote to YIVO. They have all the files.
YIVO Institute.
Yeah. Yeah. They have all the files if it exists, right?
Is that because it's Lithuania and they have a specialty of Lithuania?
I don't think so. My girlfriend got it also, and her father was from Poland.
I see.
So I think that maybe they just archived everything with YIVO. And so I got that, and it's a fascinating read. It even describes them, the interviews they had after they got to New York. But the point I want to make is that my parents were in that camp, in the DP camp, for 4 years. Wow. Until we got a visa to come to the United States. That's also a long story. I've done a lot of research on that, and I give a presentation about it. But it had a lot to do with the American quota system and what was going on behind the scenes. It wasn't always a good story.
No, I know. Yeah, it's well documented in some of the films that I've watched about how anti-Semitic the government was during this period, and how they did everything they could to deny, and even under Roosevelt. Yeah, so I'm well kind of into that, and we'll for another time it can come out.
But
we can talk about it.
Eventually, the United States changed the quota in 1950, and then we immediately got a letter to come. And sorry about that. And we got on the ship and came to the United States.
So which ship did you come to?
The SS General Baloo.
Okay, so how old were you in 1950? You were 1 year old. Okay, so you couldn't possibly remember any of.
But we have photos.
Okay.
We got lots of photos.
Okay.
I have lots of photos from the DP camp. So yeah, I don't remember the ship, but I remember, I have the photos, and we came and settled in New York.
Did you go through Ellis Island?
No, at that time, Ellis Island wasn't being used. And we were not sponsored. We were sponsored by HIAS, but because my parents didn't want anybody to pay, they didn't want a debt for the transport. So my father worked in the engine room, and so they got free transportation.
So they made a home where in New York?
Brooklyn.
Okay, and there were a lot of other survivors also probably in Brooklyn at the time?
Oh yeah. A lot of their friends, quite a number of their Lithuanian survivor friends were living in New York, in Connecticut, some in Boston, other friends in Los Angeles, but and they were a very tight group. And that's another reason I know so much about the Holocaust, is because I used to sit and listen to all their stories as they sat and told their stories.
In Yiddish or in Yiddish?
All in Yiddish. All in Yiddish.
So you speak Yiddish?
I speak, I read, I write, I translate, and I teach Yiddish.
Nice. Okay.
So, so I heard everybody's stories. When they thought I was sleeping, they would tell the stories, and they got good and drunk on vodka, and they were loud.
So how did these stories impact you? Did they give you nightmares? Did they scare you?
Yeah, they did. I realized my parents went through some kind of hell. And, I had my nightmares. My mother had her nightmares. My father had his behavior. He had his outbursts, you know, it's
So let's start on top.
textbook, textbook.
Let's talk about this for a second. So I want to kind of transition to what it was like growing up in a survivor's house. And there's a lot of questions that I can ask you, but more on a broad base. You obviously have told us that you already know so much, and you're much different that many other people who I've talked to weren't, didn't know all of what you knew coming over here, because you obviously were born in a DP camp. So they were born much later. I was born in 1958, so I'm a bit younger than you are.
Yeah, you're a Fisher.
I call it. I've heard that term. I've heard that term.
There you go.
So, what was it like? Growing up, and your sisters. You have two sisters. We were told. What was it like for you, and what was it like for your two sisters growing up in this house?
The three of us had different upbringings, let's put it that way. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, my little sister, who's 13 years younger, she had two different parents than I did, completely different, because after those 13 years, my parents had changed, obviously. And we all laughed together and say, well, you broke them in for us, you bore the brunt of this, because not only were they coming over as immigrants from Europe with European culture, European way of thinking, European child rearing expectations, trauma, and I was the firstborn.
So what was some of their trauma, if you can tell us?
Well, their trauma was the nightmares, the fears of authority, the fears for the future, the food, anything that had to do with food. I mean, I'm not telling, I'm preaching to the choir here. They had, my father had his outbursts, he would
So
have.
how was your mother's person? Your mother's personality would be described as X, and what was your father's personality? How would you describe their personalities, not when they're in outbursts, but their normal everyday personality?
If you were to meet them on a street or in a social gathering, you would think they were the most and they were. I mean, they were very positive and loving and outgoing people. They learned English. They learned to speak English without an accent. Can you imagine that?
No, I can't.
Okay.
Neither my parents were able to accomplish that. And in fact, when I was growing up, they were bullied. I was bullied because of my parents' accent, and I had to push some of the people around to tell them to knock it off. So
No, my parents were exceptional in many, many ways, and I now, knowing what I know now and doing all the research I've done and being as active as I am in second generation groups and listening to all the stories and reading, I mean, I think we've all read Helen Epstein's book and Aaron Hass's book. I mean, there are books about the 2Gs, second generation. I consider myself very fortunate because my parents, I feel, were extremely functional. And so they had their mishigas, okay? Who doesn't? But they were very functional, very effective parents, I think. They were able to get things done, but they had these fears, which.
So what was their expectation of you, your middle sister, your youngest sister?
The expectation, they were perfectionists, so they expected perfection from me as the oldest one. And of course, education was primo. And, you had to be a model kid, a model student, a model this, a model that, piano lessons, you got to practice, you got to do your homework. I mean, this was, and they couldn't help me that much with my homework.
And how about the middle sister?
The middle sister, almost similar in many ways. The younger one was a whole different ball game completely. They were quite Americanized by that time. And then don't forget, we all immigrated to Israel also. So
Mm.
there's a whole other dimension that we experience that most American survivor families did not experience.
Mhm.
And
Well,
so moving to Israel, you
when did you move to Israel?
in 1971, and so I came in 72.
And you were how old?
Oh, I was already finished with university.
And you had your
So,
doctorate already?
no, the doctorate I did later.
Okay.
And so we all came to Israel, and in Israel, everybody's, I mean, everybody knows about the Holocaust. It's in the DNA, it's in the school curriculum, it's in the government, it's in everything.
Okay, so your parents spent 4 years trying to get to the United States. They're making a career here. How long? And they spent how long in the United States before Israel?
From 1950 to 71, 21 years.
Okay, so they have obviously both. Your father has a career. What's he doing?
Well, he started off in the early years, he was a TV repairman, and then eventually he became an electronic engineer for NASA.
All right.
He
And
worked-
mother?
And my mother always was at home, but she took in, she was a seamstress. So she took in work at home and she made money that way.
So what was the switch that all of a sudden they decided to leave the United States and go to Israel? And I'm going to give you a little parallel story to this, but I'm really interested, what was the impetus for them to move everyone to Israel?
First of all, on Bloody Friday, I can't remember, it was 1969 or no, 1970, I think. I think about 15,000 engineers were laid off work in the United States.
Hmm.
So there was no work when they stopped the lunar project.
Okay, when they stopped Apollo.
No, before that.
Hmm.
So everybody was out of a job. Engineers were driving taxis. And my father got a job in a similar organization in Israel. So
That was it.
they decided they're going to go to Israel, and they asked me if I would join because I was at university. And
Where
I
were
said,
you studying? Where were you studying?
at that moment, I was at Penn State.
Well, you know,
And-
I'm from Allentown, Pennsylvania, so I'm not far away.
Well, I did my doctorate at Lehigh.
Yeah,
up the road.
my wife Myra went to Lehigh as well. Her brother got his master's at Lehigh. So you're talking to a Lehigh family here. Again, all these connections.
Hey, we're all brothers and sisters. Anyway, so that was the big push. But my grandparents and my aunt lived in Israel, so we always had this connection. I mean, I was the first one in 1965. I was first to go to Israel to visit the family.
Yeah,
So I always had a
let
connection.
me tell you a little reverse of this. My father escaped Nazi Germany at 15 on the last Hadassah Aliyot kinder transport, and he arrived at age 15 in 1936 in Port Haifa, and he grew up on Kibbutz Yagur outside of Haifa. And he fought in 28. He was in the War of Independence in 48. Mom survived, went back to Koshitse. Her father remarried, and there was a not a good situation there between the stepmother. Her mother was beloved, and he didn't really understand why his father could remarry. So that she did tell me, and I did know that. So she got on a ship called Hercules, and it was a Czechoslovakian name, but it's translated as Hercules, had 2,000 people on it, was turned back at Palestine by the British, and she went to Cyprus for another year. And then eventually she, in 1948, came to Israel, met my father on a beach in Tel Aviv. My mother was very successful. She opened a beauty salon. She was a beautician by trade, and she did very well. And they got married in 1950. And in 1954, they chose to come to the United States.
Yeah, a lot of
Yeah.
Israeli people came in those years because the situation in Israel was terrible. There was rationing, there was war, It was very, very bad. And so that story is quite common amongst
Yeah,
survivors.
the two reasons, my sister, who's 4 years older than I am, and I'm going to, it's really interesting because you're helping me understand what I never knew. It'd be interesting that my sister, and I'm going on recording, so she's going to get upset with me, but she always felt like I was the one like your sister who was the 14 years younger and she had a different parent. My sister could never reconcile, even almost to this day, she still has unreconcilable issues about the differences, how she was treated versus I was treated. And it's still, what's that? You got over it?
Over it. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to moan about it?
No, I think she has gotten over it too, but it's there.
Yeah, you get over it, and that's just the way it is. So,
but my parents said two
and
reasons.
that wasn't the end of the story. Then they went to Canada, and then they went back to the United States. The long verschleppte Meise, as
Well, your father must have been able to transfer his career to these countries and eventually went back to the space program, probably in NASA, I guess. No? What did he do?
No, it's a long story. I don't know. You want to get into it?
Well, just what did he do when he went back the second time?
He went to Canada. There was a business opportunity. Didn't work out. Then they decided to come back to the United States, and he worked for an electronics company. And then he died. And then my mother came back to Israel.
Wow.
So and my sister did as well. She graduated and then came to Israel as well. So my two sisters live in Israel to this day.
Really?
And I started.
So how many times? How frequently do you go back to Israel?
Well, when my mother was alive, I would go. Well, when she was sick, I would go 2-3 times a year. But I was living in different places. I lived in. I was in China at one point. I was in Spain. I was in Guatemala, Singapore. So I would visit from there. And
but now that you're here in the United States, how often do you visit your sisters?
I haven't been there since Mom died. It's been already 7 years, and now I have grandchildren. So my priorities have changed. And so when I do,
so are you Zooming with them?
Well, no, I go visit them. And
no,
so
I mean, don't you don't Zoom with them on an ongoing basis?
Oh, I do, but I also go to visit them. So when my granddaughter was in Saigon, she was born in Saigon, I went to visit. When they lived in Bangkok, I went to visit. Now, as of today, they're living in Mexico, but they just moved from Costa Rica. My other son lives in Tel Aviv. My daughter with the 2 children are in New York. So I keep the airlines busy.
Yeah. So let me ask you, and let me tell you, we just completed another 30 minutes. And so we were going to take a break. We're going to come back and we'll keep the progression going. We've learned about what it was like to grow up in a survivor's home. Now we're going to take it a little bit further, what it was like to get an education and what it was like to bring your spouse home to your parents who were 2nd-Gen. So that's what we have to look forward to, plus a lot more about your book. So stay tuned, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Geisner for the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. I'm talking to Ettie Zilber, who has a fantastic book that I recommend that it's on Amazon, The Holocaust Memoir of Love and Resilience, Mama's Survival from Lithuania to America. It's well worth a pickup. So we'll see you on the other side.